We're going to explore what the Bible has to say about the visit of the wise men, and subheading, and the matter of spiritual perception. Now, if that sounds like something you're not quite sure what it is, don't worry about it. I don't particularly like the wording, but it's the best I can come up with. Um, the word perception means to understand what you see, that sort of thing. If you want to turn in your Bibles with us, it's Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Very familiar story. It's a story that almost everybody knows, uh, pretty much the whole thing. But there's so much here to try to understand that you could spend hours and hours or even years studying it to try to come up with some of the answers. And I'm not going to be giving a lot of definite answers tonight about some of the things that we're talking about, but we'll talk about the possibilities and we'll look at the whole thing, especially the matter of the star and the guidance of the wise men and so on. So let's begin at chapter 2 of Matthew. Here's verses 1 and 2. Now after, I don't know how I got an extra W in there, but just strike through that if you will. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Well, I don't know about you, but for many years I puzzled over who these guys were. What would have made them associate some star in the sky with the birth of a king? So we're going to talk about that. But first I want to just share something with you because this is going to fit in later, and I want you to realize we're going somewhere practical with this. I saw a man wearing I guess it was a sweatshirt. I see some of you got Christmas sweatshirts on, and you can get verses on there or sayings or whatever you want. It was one of those kind of things. And the man's sweatshirt said, I know things and I fix things. Well, that's true of a lot of men. I'm afraid I'd have to change my wording if I got one. I know things, but I still don't fix things because I watched my dad pretty much fix everything. So I kind of know how things are done, but I never paid enough attention to know what's the right tool maybe, or what's the right process. I did do a little work around the house this week, but even that turned out well because Rick gave me some advice on how to do it. So he probably forgot about that. That was last week. Thanks for the tip on the anchors. The wise men could have wore that t-shirt or sweatshirt. We know things and we fix things. But you're going to find some people in the account tonight that knew things, never fixed anything. And there's a big difference, especially when it comes to our spiritual life. What we know should translate into what we do, how we live. So let's talk about the wise men. And the big question before us is this: who were the wise men? Who were they? Well, backing up just a moment so we see it again. Wise men from the east. Remember back when we were talking about the location of the Garden of Eden was to the east? And we said it was directly east from where Moses would have been writing when he penned the book of Genesis. I don't know if they had pens, but you know what I mean, when he wrote it somehow. And the same thing applies here when we're talking about from the east of where Matthew lived, which was in Israel. He was directly from the northern province of Galilee, directly east of where he was, I think is the best way to think about this. So who were the wise men? They were men who traveled from the east to the west following the star to see the king. Now, there's that little inset down there in the middle of the screen from this map I'm using from BibleMapper.com, which is a close-up on Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So I had to go around that. So that's why it's up above. But basically, if you look where Jerusalem is, on the left, over near the Mediterranean Sea, and then look directly east, you're going to find the city of Babylon. So when Matthew is writing, the Babylonians are no longer, I mean, there are people there, the Babylonians, I guess you would say, but the Babylonian Empire is long gone. The empire of Nebuchadnezzar, which took Daniel and others captive and brought about the 70-year captivity, that kingdom is long gone. The Persians came in and took that kingdom away from the Babylonians. It was a Persian kingdom for a long time. Then the Greeks come in and defeated the Persians and took the land. And the people that Matthew is referencing here is a tribe, the Middle Eastern tribe, called the Parthians, who basically rebelled against Greek rule in the south and established a Parthian empire. And that was for about 400 or so years, about 200 years before Christ was born, about 200 years after. And of course, the Romans would have loved to have it and so on, but the Parthians kept turning back the Romans because they were expert horsemen and their cavalry kept defeating the Roman legions. So the Parthians would include all the people that were Babylonian descent, Persian descent, and even Jewish people that never came back when Nehemiah and Ezra and all them came back. So there's a whole different groups of populations there. It was someone then from that area. So let's talk about the wise men. They're called the Magi in the New American Standard Version and in the New International Version. The New King James we're using here tonight, it just says wise men, and we're all used to that term. There is a reason they were called wise men. They were counselors. They were advisors to kings. The Greek word is actually not from the word magician. However, back in Daniel is called one of the group of men, and there's several terms for him. One of the terms for the position that Daniel held when he first went to serve Nebuchadnezzar was magicians. And I think maybe that carried over. But the Greek word magoi, which is plural, it means many, is the word used here. And number two, as we've already referenced here, these wise men were from the east, the Parthian Empire, which emerged after the fall of the Persian Empire and Greek rule. Number three, the Parthians were expert horsemen whose cavalry continued to fend off the Romans for 400 years. I think eventually the Romans got in there, but they were able to defeat the Roman legions, which moved very slow, and they were able to defeat the Roman cavalry because they were such expert horsemen. I read one account that said the Parthians could gallop in full retreat from the battlefield at full gallop and turn around. They developed somehow the method to turn around and shoot or fire their arrows straight backwards while going this way. I have no idea how they contort themselves to do that. But one of the things that made their cavalry so formidable is they had mounted archers. The Magi served the king in the Parthian Empire, just like they did in the Persian Empire and the Babylonians before them. The Magi were, that whole process, I should say that maybe that whole form of administration was carried over. The Magi then served the king as a body of government officials, advisors, and astrologers. Now, astrology is especially forbidden in the Old Testament law, but that doesn't mean Daniel was an astrologer or a magician. There was everything, all kinds of these Magi with all sorts of expertise. And you remember what Daniel's expertise was interpreting dreams in particular. And that came into play with Nebuchadnezzar and later other rulers as well. But this is key because the Magi always had their eye on the sky. Now, they didn't. It didn't mean that all the Magi were anything more than idol worshippers, pantheistic, all different gods. Not that's the wrong word. Not pantheistic, but forget the other word. Multiple gods. Anyway, uh, just like the Greeks were, or just like the Romans were, they had a lot of different gods. It was just all uh, false idol worshiping type of religion. But it's quite possible that some of these magi were not in that category at all. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments. But let's move on again to verse 2. And notice here in verse 2 it says, when they came to Jerusalem, by the way, why did they go to Jerusalem? Well, you say, well, the star guided them there. I think the star pointed them in that general direction, but it was also natural they would go to the capital city of what was due east, too. When they get to Jerusalem, they say, where is he who is born King of the Jews? It's not just a king they're looking for, but they're looking for the one who's to be born the King of the Jews. For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, someone who has many gods can add another god to their worship, okay? But these guys could well have been individuals that worship the God of heaven. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So we need to address this next question as we're just still introducing this. Why would they have followed the star? Okay, they saw the star. Why would they have associated it with the king that was to be king of the Jews, and why would they have bothered to follow it to worship this person? That's a legitimate question to ask. For years I thought they just saw something curious and just took off after it. That's where they ended up. But that's not correct. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they came to worship. They had more information than that. So why would they have followed the star? One source I checked out, which is worldhistory.org, makes a point of saying that there was an enclave of Jews in the Parthian Empire that worshiped God. So what are they doing over there? Well, you remember the story of the account of the Jews going back in the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, and Cyrus letting them go back and issuing the decree. And that's going to come into this play in just a few minutes as well. And then under Ezra and Zerubbabel, and they came back and reestablished what Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had destroyed, rebuilt the city, rebuilt the temple. But they didn't all come back. For whatever reasons, maybe they weren't all allowed to come back, but there was a group of them that stayed, and were still there basically 400 or 500 years later. Now, number 2 here, the Jews, including Daniel and Nehemiah, among others probably, had previously served the Babylonian and Persian kings in similar capacities as these magi are now serving the Parthians, the Parthian king. The kings wanted advisors that were the most intelligent, most educated, most knowledgeable advisors they could get. So the magi were scholars, among other things, and they had access to all kinds of ancient documents, a great library that they could refer to, and possibly at least some of the Old Testament, if not a lot of it. Why? Well, Daniel, the book of Daniel, is part of our Old Testament, right? It's quite, I think, quite possible. In fact, very, very likely that they had a copy of or knew about at least Daniel's 70-year prophecy, 70 weeks prophecy, I should say. So that moves us on to the next screen. Why would they have followed the star? Most importantly, these magi had, I think, access to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. This is in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Now, over there on that music stand is a technical explanation of the 70 weeks prophecy for those of you that want to delve into it. Basically, Daniel prophesied. The angel came and gave him the prophecy, and he wrote in his book, we have it in the Old Testament, that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem till the Messiah come would be 69 weeks of years, or what is that? I'm getting my weeks mixed up. 7 times 69. But anyway, that command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem was made by Cyrus when Nehemiah went back and first built the walls. We know the exact date on the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar was 360 days in a year, not 365, so you can't match up the Gregorian calendar necessarily. But if you use a 360-year calendar and you trace out those, someone do 7 times 69 for me. Tell me that number real quick. 483. 483. I knew it was 83 something. Okay. I can't do that kind of math in my head these days very quickly. Maybe never. So 483 years would elapse, it says. And after, Daniel says in his prophecy, after the 483 years elapses, the Messiah is cut off, referencing the cross of Christ. 483 years after a known date, 360 days in a year, falls on the day Christ entered into Jerusalem, the week or so before his crucifixion, on what we call the triumphal entry. The end of those 69 weeks, 483 years, ends at that point. And after that, just as Daniel says, the Messiah is cut off. And then he says, sometime in the future, there'll be one more week. One more 7 years. And he goes on to identify the abomination of desolation the Antichrist will commit that Jesus speaks about in Matthew 24. So we know that last week is the tribulation period on our chart we've been looking at. Very, very specific on the date of the coming of the Messiah. And a direct reference to what will happen after he comes back, which is something we're still looking for, obviously. So it was a matter of spiritual perception that the wise men were able to do what they did. A matter of spiritual perception that we can define as spiritual awareness or insight. Now, where does that come from? Number 6, possessing spiritual perception or spiritual insight hinges on biblical knowledge and obedience. You can know, you can have half of it, but if you do not act upon it or obey it, it really is worthless to you. They not only attached the significance of what they were seeing in the sky to the birth of the Messiah, and I think they were watching the sky very carefully, waiting for something that would tell them that the Messiah had been born. Now, they were not necessarily expecting it to be maybe the way it turned out, but when they saw what they saw something out of the ordinary, different from what they saw on every other night, and they attached the significance of that, I think, to the prophecy of of Daniel about the coming of the Messiah, the King of the Jews, and they followed it. There is a prophecy in the book of Numbers, prophecy of Balaam. I forgot to jot the reference down here, that actually mentions a star in reference to the nation of Israel and their king and so forth. So it wasn't totally just out of the blue. Now, all that said, let's go on to the next question here as we go through this. What was the star they followed? They couldn't have just said, well, okay, there's a star, it's there every night, let's follow that one. No, it would not have had any significance. So they're looking for something unusual. And they're expecting God to mark the birth in this way. So they see something which the Greek in Matthew, that Matthew uses, it says star in English, but the Greek allows for any point of light in the heavens. They didn't understand the difference between planets and stars. You see, we see planets sometimes, we say there's a star, and it's really Jupiter or Venus or something. And Venus is called the evening star. It's one that's brightest in the, near the horizon. So they would have been familiar with all that. So it had to be something special. What was it? Well, there's been lots of suggestions, but the scripture doesn't say. Here are some suggestions. Some people say it was a meteor. That doesn't make sense because meteors, you see a shooting star, how long does that last? 5 minutes from now, you don't know what direction it was going in. You just saw it. Not going to be a meteor. How about a comet? Halley's Comet is the biggest comet we usually talk about. They come very rarely, so that would be significant. But comets like Halley's Comet comes back on a regular interval every so many years, and they would have known that. So that would not have been different. That would have been the same old, same old. Some have suggested a supernova. A supernova is when a star, which is like our sun, basically flames out and it's destroyed from the inside out. I don't know all the technical way to explain that. But supernovas produce a very bright star for quite considerable time in the sky. In fact, some people think that's what this was. And they are unexpected. They just happen. But a supernova would have been so bright that everybody would have noticed it. This seems to have been something that was unusual, that the wise men noted because they studied the sky, and nobody else even really noticed much at all. Everybody would have been talking about a supernova. Nobody else was following the star. And then there's the idea of a conjunction of planets. This was first offered as a possible solution by Johann Kepler, an astronomer way, way back in the Middle Ages. And the theory has been around ever since. The most recent, I think, iteration of this was in a DVD called The Christmas Star. The author, the man that produced the DVD at least, was a man by the name of Frederick Larson. Very interesting. I have a copy of it. You want to borrow it or look at it, or you can get it off Amazon. He believes it was a conjunction of planets. And it could well have been. But if you object to that and say, no, it had to be more than that, just hang on. Okay? We got to work through this logically. So listen to the whole first. He says it was a conjunction of planets. A conjunction of planets is when, like, Venus and Jupiter in their orbits, from Earth's perspective, cross. And sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's like this, sometimes it's very close. There was a very close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter around the time of Christ's birth. Now, Larson holds the view that he was born in about 2 BC. Majority of other people say Jesus was born more like 4 BC, and it all depends on when Herod died, because we know Herod was alive when he was born. And nobody's 100% sure when Herod died. There's two views on that. But basically, somewhere between 2 and 4 BC, Jesus was born. And there were multiple conjunctions of planets in that time frame. Larson follows a whole process, and it's fascinating, and he has a lot of good things to say. But I don't think there's anything that we can really come up with to say definitively this is what it was. Let's go on. Here's what a conjunction of planets is. You see the Earth in the center. The sun's much bigger than the Earth, but the sun's further away in this artist rendition, so it's very small. And the Earth is orbiting the sun in a small orbit there. Then Jupiter is orbiting the sun, and then finally Saturn. The two brightest planets are Jupiter and Saturn. This is actually, I think, a rendition of a conjunction that occurred back in 2020, just 5 years ago. And it happened in December or thereabouts, and people were talking about this is the Christmas star. So, yes.
Is there supposed to be a picture on the screen?
Oh, yeah, that would be helpful. There you go. Thank you, Robbie. I just forgot to push the button. I know things, but I don't always fix things. Okay. The Great Conjunction in 2020. Now I can even read it better on my little screen here. It was Saturn and Jupiter. The conjunctions that occurred back in the time period I'm talking about, 4 to 2 BC, primarily, if I remember right, Jupiter and Venus, but there were different ones, and probably one of these as well. You say, okay, that's fine. You see the two planets close together, kind of from the naked eye, without a telescope, would look like a really bright star. That makes sense. But how do you follow that? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Two other suggestions are a nova, not a supernova, but a nova. A nova is a star that gets brighter for a while and then it just kind of goes back. It doesn't explode, burn up, destroy itself. It occurs, a nova could occur unexpectedly. That would be something they would notice. And it would also be something that hardly anybody else would notice, because it's not as big and bright as a supernova. And then finally, we have this matter of, well, it was just something God miraculously did, a supernatural phenomenon. So which is it? Didn't we have this up there a minute ago? Yeah, we ruled out meteor, comet, and supernova. The conjunctions, possibility, the nova, a possibility, and the supernatural phenomenon is a possibility. So let's talk about how any of these things could have been followed. Well, first of all, stars rise in the east and set in the west every night. That's because the Earth's rotation is from west to east. So stars follow the opposite as the Earth rotates. So they always come up in the east and they move west. Remember, the wise men said, we have seen his star where? In the east. Well, they were seeing it in the east every night. And then the next few hours would take it, as the Earth spin, clear to the west every night. So it wasn't they were following something very slowly for months and months, because it may have taken 3, 4, 5, even 6 months to get there. And they didn't even leave until after the baby was born, according to what we saw here in the first 2 verses. So every night, there would probably be some difference as to the time and maybe how high it was in the sky when they first noticed it in the east, but eventually, every night it would track out in the west. So they get a general direction from this very particular, unusual star, so they move west. So Stars rise in the east and set in the west, as does the moon and the sun due to the Earth's rotation, which is from west to east. The movement is observed in both northern and southern hemispheres. During equinoxes, they rise directly in the east and set directly in the west, but during summer and winter, they shift in their setting position and end of horizon, for that matter, a little bit north and south. This would have been in the winter, so it would have been setting more in the southwest, which may be critical to this whole argument. Now, only the last three that we listed there are possibilities. Conjunction of planets, a nova, or something supernatural.